When we started to put together the third annual Maritime Risk Symposium, we looked at a couple of the projects we really wanted to highlight that dealt with risk. And Isaac Maya and I sat down and we said one of the centerpieces of it had to be protect and how we use game theory. So this next session is going to be on protect, but we really want to make it an interactive session with questions throughout. I'm Joe DiRenzo. I'm Coast Guard Atlantic Area's Chief of Ops Analysis. Introduce my panel. First up, you've already had him mentioned multiple times, Dr. Matt Clark. He is the Director of S&T's University Programs. He administers the 12 University Program DHS Centers of Excellence and the $50 million grant program. But one of the unique things you don't know about Matt is that he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala, which says a lot about him. Next to him is Dr. Malin Tambay. And within Coast Guard Atlantic Area and Pacific Area and the R&D Center, the three entities that made it up, Dr. Tambay is known as the creator of Protect. Him and his team core group here at the University of Southern California developed the algorithms in total, complete partnership, not only with the three Coast Guard entities that I mentioned, but also, and this is one of the best unity of effort stories that our service has, with our friends at Coast Guard headquarters in both the Office of Defense Operations at the time and then Coast Guard 095, the Strategic Directorate. That kind of partnership is pretty extraordinary because the operators and the policy folks were working hand in hand. Next to Dr. Tambay is Lieutenant Katie Moretti, but I should be referring to her as Lieutenant Commander Select Katie Moretti since she was selected for promotion just 2 weeks ago. Katie's a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. She's got her master's from William & Mary, and one of the most difficult jobs that she has, besides working for me, is she led our command center at Coast Guard Atlantic Area, which means she was coordinating long-range search and rescue cases using our big deck cutters, working with other nations, the merchant community. And if you've never been in that position as a controller, it can be both demanding and tense at times. Next to him, but certainly not least, is Craig Baldwin. Craig is a retired naval officer, former F-14 squadron commander. He also served on the faculty of the Naval Postgraduate School where he was the chair of their Naval Space Systems department. Craig has been the lead scientist from the R&D Center on Protect. Now to set the table, and the way we've got this established is, I'm going to set the table, Matt's going to actually bring out the china, put it out with the silverware, Malin's going to cook the feast with Katie, and then Craig is going to eat it for us. So first let's talk about how this whole thing started. The Coast Guard Atlantic Area Commander, before Admiral Parker, my boss, was then Vice Admiral, now Admiral Robert Patt, Commandant of the Coast Guard. He came back from one of his trips to the outside, pulled a bunch of us aside and said, you know, our patrols are about as random as the guards on Hogan's Heroes. For those of you that are older than 30 years old, you know what I'm talking about. Hogan was successful because he knew when the guards were making a turn at the gate every day, because that's the way they were trained. So we got together and started taking a look at how we would approach something like this. And we stumbled across, literally, the work that Team Corps had done at LAX. And it was fascinating. They had been able to take less resources and get more results for it. And when you're in the Coast Guard, doing more with less is not only a cultural way we do business, but it literally is at the heart and soul of our ethos, because we do get every penny out of not only our assets, but our commitment to the American public. So we talked to USC. I remember like it was yesterday, the first phone call with Isaac Maya, saying, you guys have done a great job on land. How'd you like to try it on the water? And when an academic responds, that's an intriguing question, you know you've hooked them. So we then started the partnership and we selected Boston. And what was really unique about this whole thing was two things. First, we also brought in the Coast Guard Forces Command. And I was very lucky that Rear Admiral Sullivan, who's here sitting next to us, now retired, and his staff got the idea that, you know, we're going to try something unique. We're going to build a tactics, techniques, and procedure at the same time we're going to run a model and build a model. It's never been done before in the 200 plus years of our service. The other thing is, our goal was at the end of the trial, we were going to sit down with the operators and basically say, did it work? And for those of you that have ever met a Coast Guard first or second class bosun mate, those are truly our heart and soul of our organization, they'll tell you if it doesn't work. Trust me, in artful, colorful terms. So we started the process, and at the end of the 60 days, Craig and I and David Boyd from PAC area, our PAC area counterpart, walked into Station Boston and sat down, and trust me, I now know what it feels like to be a visitor at Fenway Park, because across from me were 8 very, very gruff-looking individuals, and the first words out of their mouth was, "Don't stop this. This is the best thing that you have given us, because we've got more time to do maintenance, we've got more time to do training, we know when we're getting underway." And one first class made the point that stayed with me forever. He said, "I didn't join the Coast Guard to patrol between 7 and 3 o'clock Monday through Friday with an hour out for lunch. I want to be out there at 2 a.m. in the morning. I want to be out there when it's cold. I want to be out there when our adversary will be able to take a vulnerability and pick it apart." So with that background, I'd like to turn it over to Matt Clark. Matt will talk about the case study that DHS S&T did on Protect. Matt.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I don't have, this is not me, needless to say, I don't have any slides, and I'm going to try not to take too long. I'm going to be talking about Protect, but in very general terms, because we've learned a tremendous amount from Protect. And one of the things that we've learned at university programs is that we have to be willing to operate both from the top down and the bottom up. You know, innovation can come from just about anywhere, and in this case, it came from both the Coast Guard and the Create Center of Excellence. The Coast Guard's motto is Semper Paratus, and I think you've seen a lot of examples here of them, you know, being ready. They're being very flexible, they're adapting to changing conditions, and that's sort of what we want to do. Our enterprise is experimental and it's scientific. You know, those are the two things that we want to stay within bounds on. It has to be experimental. I don't want anybody on my staff or myself to ever say we've always done it this way, because that's not the way it's going to work. So, you know, particularly in a growing organization, we have only about 7 years as a Centers of Excellence program, and we didn't know what we were doing when we started. We know a little bit better now, but we got a long way to go to be really good partners with our operating agencies, components, and the first responder community. It's not easy. The centers, universities in general, are not cut out to deliver product to people who are operational. And this is where I get into Protect. This is where the mold got broken. You know, this is where, you know, some very clever, innovative people saw what the centers could do and applied it, you know, saw it, recognized it as a pattern that they could use in their environment, and did that. The things that made it successful weren't just that they were clever about applying things, and I want to give a little bit of credit both to Melinda Tombe and Joe and Katie Moretti, you know, and Craig. All these people are the ones who actually made all this stuff happen, as well as the other folks at the R&D Center who are sitting back there, and they got support from the operational command. You know, that's a big deal. That's what I'm trying to get at, is that we're willing to work from people at the top down, and right now we're getting a better hold working with Coast Guard from the top down. You know, trying to get people at the 2-star and 3-star levels attention is very difficult. You know, they're so busy, and people are trying to sell them all the time. We're not trying to sell anybody anything. We're trying to help people solve problems. As I said a lot of times, I'm proposing a marriage. You know, we'll in an old-fashioned way, we'll stick with it until we come up with some sort of solution. It may not be what we'd intended originally, but we'll stick with it. So we're looking with partners. The headquarters folks at Coast Guard are paying attention because the operational people at Coast Guard showed that they could do a lot with a little bit of resources. One of the things about working with the centers is that they're incredibly cheap. It's built on the back of very willing indentured servants, the grad students. They will work all night long to come up with a solution. They love working with the Coast Guard. They love working with the Customs and Border Protection. They want to be out there with the operators, and it's really exciting for them. Their research is not done in isolation. It's done in a real-world environment, and it's making a big difference. So how did this thing work? Well, I already mentioned that it's because of the people, You had Coast Guard and the COE people who had initiative, and you had COE folks who were really responsive. You know, they were willing to get out of their shells. I mean, Malin's a computer scientist, for God's sake. You know, what is he doing out on a boat in Boston Harbor at 3 in the morning? But he did. He did do that. He was willing to do that, I'm sure. And a lot of the centers, we're pushing them off out of their comfort zones. They still have to do good research. They still have to publish papers. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. In order to work with us, you've got to be willing to, you know, basically roll up your sleeves and get out there with the coxswains and the bosuns and those guys who actually have to do the work, you know, or the border guards or the patrolmen who are out there. So the people were, you know, the key to the thing, and I could stop there. The people were the key to the thing. People willing to work, willing to solve problems, willing to get through it. You can talk to some of the folks who have. Protect is not done. Protect is still sort of in nascent stages and being rolled out bit by bit, but it's not out there as a commercially viable product yet that's available to people across the world, which is what we would like it to be. It's not our job to make sure it is commercialized. It is our job to make sure that the centers think about how it's going to get commercialized. How are they going to get it into the hands of end users? And for this thing, there's a lot of pathways. And one of them that's been very important, and we were just in a unique position to work with the Coast Guard R&D Center, who will help us refine these models and make them so that they work in an operational environment and can do the upkeep, you know, can do the long tail of any technology that you throw over the fence. The R&D Center is willing to do that. Nobody else has that. We got lucky in that we were working with the right people. It has not been without problems. We try to put in a couple of different things for anybody who's in the Coast Guard is interested, or anybody in any DHS agency who's interested. We put in a couple of different mechanisms. Our underlying funding arrangement is through a cooperative agreement, which is like a grant, but we also put in these contracts on top of it that DHS let us do because they'd been so thoroughly competed that the Coast Guard could use to go directly to the center. It was not that easy. You know, we bump into things all the time. There's going to be hurdles, there's going to be pitfalls, and we've had plenty of phone calls from Bert Masesker over there about issues that haven't come out quite the way we wanted, and we want to hear that. We want to know it. This is a growing enterprise, and it's going to screw up. It's like a marriage. That's why I said that. So what else made it work? There's operational research. There's smart people on both sides. They're very, very smart. That was exciting for both of them to work with each other. Probably the best thing about this whole project is that we weren't involved. This happened without OUP being engaged at all. You know, this is from people at the operating components going to the centers and figuring it out themselves, and that's the way it's supposed to work. 1 minute, all right. And he's making a bad face. So anyways, don't forget, I give you the money. To everybody, you know, you got to learn to take advantage of the COEs. You also, I mean, the Coast Guard has done it. Talk to these guys, see how it did, see what went right, see what went wrong. You know, we're all open kimono. But they have incredible capabilities. As Dan had said, and Deputy Undersecretary Gerstein said, you know, we got 207 universities or something. It could be 203 this week. But nonetheless, they have tremendous capabilities. They're supposed to be a permanent part of the DHS infrastructure. They can do what universities do well. They do not take the place of people who are doing the big D development. They do the research end, they'll provide students, they can do quick response stuff. If you want to talk to folks who do the big development stuff, An Dong is here, who's the director of our Borders and Maritime division. Those are the guys who handle the big projects for S&T, working with both Borders and Maritime. If you have big ideas, talk to her. If you have little ideas, you know, talk to Theo Gamelis, who's my program manager for Borders and Maritime. Having said that, you know, that's all I have to say, and I really appreciate everybody here. It's a pretty interesting crowd. Thanks.
I wanted to say that this work was only possible because of all of the fantastic graduate students and postdocs whose names are listed here. Boan, Eric Shea, Rong Yang, and my colleague Fernando Ordonez, and others who are all sitting there at the table there. and of course, other co-authors of this work, Craig Baldwin, and Joe DiRenzo, Ben Moll, and Garrett Meyer. So I'll start out by just laying out Protect. We've heard about it already. The goal here was to assist in port protection by planning patrols that considered target values and risks, the fact that time and distance, and the fact that an adversary can conduct surveillance and then respond. And therefore, we wanted to randomize our patrols, taking into account the fact that different targets have different risks and so forth. As you've heard, we started in the Port of Boston in April, went to Port of New York in February of 2012, and the goal is to roll it out to other ports. So let me give you a little bit of the background of the work we've done with the applications of game theory for security. We first started in 2007 at the LAX airport. This was April of 2007. The challenge here is there are 6 inbound roads into LAX, but not enough officers to have checkpoints on all roads at all times. There's 8 terminals, but only 3 or 4 K9 units that are active, and therefore not enough to be at all terminals at all times. So the question is, where and when do you deploy these checkpoints and K9 units, knowing that an adversary can conduct surveillance and then respond? So we solved this problem using a game theoretic approach, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the system is still in operation. If you drive back to LAX, you may see a checkpoint or K9 patrols that are scheduled by Armor. Following that, we started work with the Federal Air Marshal's Service. The challenge here, again, is that we are looking only at the international sector. There are thousands of flights, international flights every day, but not enough air marshals to be on all flights. Again, because of insider threats, because of websites that talk about spotting an air marshal and so forth, there's also the sense that an adversary may know where the air marshals are and so forth. And therefore, to avoid predictability and yet taking into account the fact that different flights have different risks, allocation of air marshals to flights in a randomized fashion becomes an interesting research challenge. This is a topic of another PhD thesis of one of my students, Manish Jain, and his algorithm is deployed in the system called IRIS that is in use by the Federal Air Marshal's Service since 2009. We've also developed an algorithm called GUARDS for the TSA that's in evaluation, and this is for protecting the airport itself rather than checking passengers. And then today morning, we also heard about this TRUST program, which is for patrolling trains. Here we are looking for people who travel without tickets initially to try to validate the model, because there's we can catch a lot of people, and therefore should get a good sense of how well the model is working. So this is sort of the baseline from which we started. But what's new in Protect? The first thing is this is a very large domain. So therefore, we had to develop a compact model of the problem. Secondly, all the previous approaches that we worked with took the initial right first step, which is to assume that an adversary is all-knowing, all observing, and can act with absolutely perfect rationality. Protect starts to relax that assumption by using a quantum response model of the adversary, which I'll talk about. Therefore, we also had to develop new efficient algorithms for patrol planning. And finally, in terms of evaluation, we had to do new types of evaluation. I'll go into some of these human experiments with human subjects to validate the use of the quantum response model, but also real-world evaluation that Katie will talk about in terms of comparing patrol schedules before and after in the Port of Boston, as well as evaluation by an adversary perspective team. So in the rest of this short presentation, I will first give you a background and the way we approach the modeling of the domain, talk very quickly about the quantum response model and algorithm, and then go into evaluation. So the game theoretic approach that we follow is one of Stackelberg games. Some of you may be very familiar with these, but these are games where security forces must act first, adversary observes, and then responds. So suppose this is laid out as a 2x2 game, just as a very small example here. So supposing there's two patrols that we can do. Patrol 1 can only protect target 1, and patrol 2 can only protect target 2. Now, if the Coast Guard were always trying to do patrol 1, then an adversary would observe that and respond by attacking target 2. The adversary would get a positive reward of 3, and the Coast Guard would get a negative reward here, -2. If as a result the Coast Guard were to switch and move to always using Patrol 2, the adversary will now also switch and attack target 1. The adversary again gets a positive reward of 7. The Coast Guard again get a negative reward, -7. So any deterministic strategy an adversary can defeat. If the Coast Guard were to use a randomized strategy, a mixed strategy, so that's say 60% of the time they do Patrol 1 and 40% of the time they do Patrol 2, an adversary conducting surveillance will only know that they conduct Patrol 1 60% of the time and Patrol 2 40% of the time. What they will do tomorrow remains unpredictable. The goal here is to increase the cost and uncertainty for an adversary and thus improve the defender expected reward. These kinds of games are called Stackelberg games because the defender acts first. An adversary can conduct surveillance and then respond. The key challenge here is this is a 2x2 game. Undergraduate students in my class can solve this by hand in their final exam and so forth. But when we really have a game with billions of patrolling patterns and large numbers of targets, the problem becomes very difficult to solve. And our contributions of my research group have been in coming up with fast algorithms that can solve these problems quickly. So just to give you an illustration of how this game may get laid out, these are not the actual patrolling areas in the Port of Boston, but we may have a particular patrol that takes place here, and so we can lay out all the different patrolling types of patrols that can take place within the Port of Boston, and we can start to develop a game. On the rows here are all of the different patrols. Now you notice that in each, when you visit each area, it's labeled with K1 and K2 and so forth. These are the different kinds of activities we may conduct in that patrolling area. Different activities take different amounts of time. We have a limited time budget, which means that we have all these different patrolling possibilities, and as I said, billions of possible possibilities. And then on the columns are all the different targets an adversary could attack. And if a patrol can cover a target, then that means that the target is covered. If a target is left uncovered, for example, target D is left uncovered by the first patrol, then if the adversary were to attack it, the adversary gets a positive reward, the Coast Guard get a negative reward. And so we can develop a big game matrix like this. Now solving this becomes a big challenge, and here's where some of our techniques come to become important. The first thing here is to develop a more compact game matrix, and that's done by noticing that some of these patrolling patterns are identical in terms of the payoffs that appear in the game matrix. So we can start to collapse the game matrix. We can notice that some strategies are dominated by other strategies, some patrols are dominated by other patrols. So we start constructing a more compact game matrix. So overall, we start with the graph of the port, and then we create these compact game matrices. We solve them with this algorithm called PASAC, which is again a PhD thesis of my PhD student Rong Yang. As I said, each of these has been a fantastic PhD thesis challenge. From there, we develop probability distribution over these compact strategies, and then finally we generate patrols. Let me just very quickly talk about the control response model. This is a relaxation of the perfect rationality assumption that's normally used in usual game theoretic approaches. What this is saying is that the adversary now does not just select one target that maximizes their expected utility as the one target they will always select, but as a boundedly rational human being, there's a certain probability with which they may even attack a target which has a lower value to them. And therefore our algorithms that way are taking into account the fact that the adversary may deviate from this perfect rationality assumption. And there are different factors here. All this goes into a optimization problem. This was the key to Rong's recent work and advance in sort of improving this, being able to solve this problem very, very quickly. And that leads us now to actually, I mean, I'm not going to go into the algorithm, but basically going to try to evaluate this work. So one of the things she did was to look at the quantum response model and say, okay, if we were to present this challenge to a human adversary, how would a quantum response approach work against something that assumes a perfectly rational model of a human adversary, or something very simple like a uniform random approach. So she constructed this game, which is a web-based game. So you see different targets, each of them with different rewards and penalties, different probabilities of a guard being there or not. And then by testing it against many, many human subjects, you can you can generate a graph like this. What this is showing is different games. This is 4 out of many, many games she's tested. And out of these 4 games, for each of these games, on the y-axis is the total expected defender reward. Higher is better, lower is worse. The QR is the red bar. Armor and so forth, those are the previous algorithms that assume perfect rationality model of a human adversary. PT is the prospect theory model, another very well-known model for modeling human behaviors. And this is averaged over many, many human subjects, and what you can see is that the quantum response model performs better than a model assuming perfect rationality on part of the adversary, as in Armor or the prospect theory models. And this is confirming some of the work that is already, there are many other studies that talk about the quantum response model performing better than a model assuming perfect rationality against human subjects. And this confirms this even in this context of security games. So this is this helped us gain confidence in continuing to use this quantum response model. One of the interesting things that comes out of PROTECT is the ability for us to quantify the effectiveness of different patrol, the amounts of time we spend on the water. So on the x-axis here is maximum amounts of patrol time, and on the y-axis is defender expected utility. Higher is better. This is basically trying to quantify the effectiveness of different amounts of patrol given a certain model of a human adversary. And so given different models, we can say, okay, when is it enough? When does it not bias anymore to add more patrol time to our existing patrols? We can do qualitative comparisons of, say, for example, here with an airport, without an airport being included in our area of responsibility, or with an airport being included, and we can see here that the airport really means that up to 90 minutes of patrol time has no benefit to us whatsoever, because the airport can always be attacked. And therefore, this may be an opportunity for us to engage in conversation with local partners to say that if they were to take up the security of the airport, then we may be able to reduce the amount of time we spend in our own patrols. But this defender expected utility, this measure, which is calculated using the RIN numbers and so forth, allows us to compare many different things, so different algorithms for protection under different assumptions of how much surveillance an adversary is conducting. And I won't have time to go into all of this, but basically here is showing this Dobbs algorithm, which assumes a perfectly rational adversary, versus PASAC, which is our quantum response model, showing under different models of the adversary that when you start assuming that this adversary surveillance is imperfect, that we do better with the quantum response model, whereas a model that assumes perfectly rational adversary degrades. Again, this is just showing that the quantum response model allows a certain amount of robustness. So it gets beyond the point where we are assuming a superhuman adversary who has perfect knowledge, perfect surveillance, perfect everything, and allows us to go beyond that. And so we really like this quantum response model, which is what we've been pushing forward. I wanted to, at this point, hand over evaluation to discussion of evaluation to Katie, and also I wanted to thank David Ebert's work with us in the early stages of this project for doing helping us with some of these evaluations.
So we had the opportunity to compare actual patrol schedules from the Port of Boston conducted by Coast Guard patrol boats before and after PROTECT. And the pre-PROTECT figure, the x-axis is the day of the week in both the figures. X-axis is the day of the week, and the y-axis is the number of times the patrol area was visited for that given day of the week. You can see the y-axis is intentionally left blank because of security reasons. This is actual data from the Port of Boston. And the values in the graphs are averages of a year's worth of real patrol data. In the pre-PROTECT figure, just moving the mic. In the pre-PROTECT figure, notice a definite pattern in the patrols. On day 2, you can see a dearth in patrols, but in day 5, there's an increase in the number of patrols. And this pattern goes away post-PROTECT. The reason for this, I think, was mentioned earlier in conversation, that there were training exercises scheduled on day 2, whereas on day 5, Coast Guard Reserve members were available to help with activities, and so they could conduct more patrols. Besides the pattern, notice the lines in the pre-protect figure tend to vacillate, indicating that some days higher value targets were visited more often, and in other days they were visited less often, while the value of the target did not change day to day. And then you can see there's less intersection of those lines post-protect, and those lower lines on the post-protect figure also indicate that those targets have a lower payout value and are not visited as often. So we show that Protect eliminated predictable patrol patterns, but the Coast Guard needed a way to evaluate whether the actions of the crews were effective. So we devised the adversarial perspective team, made up of terrorism subject matter experts, to conduct assessment of patrols before and after Protect, incorporating the adversary's known intent, capabilities, skills, and cultural influences. The Coast Guard applied value-focused thinking to assess discernible changes in the tactical deterrence from the APT's recorded observations. Value-focused thinking is a decision theory methodology that assists decision makers in to formalize their decision-making process into a quantifiable, defendable, and repeatable process. It's commonly applied throughout the Department of Defense, and the value-focused thinking category and weighting structure is often driven by the subject matter expert and their decision-making process. In that regard, the resulting quantitative process closely resembles the decision makers' values and even their bias. This decision framework was particularly relevant in application to terrorism. So it's important to note 2 things. The APT was made up of terrorism SMEs from our Intel group and others that they brought in. And the assessments were conducted as blind evaluations. That is, the operators didn't know that they were conducting these evaluations. In fact, only a handful of people actually knew that they were there, and those were our local investigators and law enforcement, just in case they got arrested for terrorism-like activities, suspicion of, I guess. So the value-focused thinking uncovered some positive trends. The deterrence value of the Protect patrols, as perceived by this APT group, is generally increasing. And the pre-Protect small boat average VFT deterrence value, if you could get that, because I barely could, was a value of about 0.45. And compared with the post-Protect value was 0.731. And that number isn't necessarily important. The idea, the takeaway here is that the APT believed that the efforts of the crews to provide more deterrence after Protect was implemented. And this increase in deterrence, again, which was perceived by our APT, is largely driven by the higher officer presence by the small boat patrols. 33% of the observed pre-Protect patrols had, quote, high officer presence, whereas 75% of the post-Protect patrols. It means the officers were, the boat crews were out on deck observing and making their presence known to the potential adversary. And this high officer presence as a result of Protect is likely driven by the trainings, tactics, and procedures changes that were implemented following the interim APT brief that happened during the Boston rollout. TTP is one of the best outcomes of Protect for the end user. For years, our boat crews were simply told to go out and protect the waterways. Little guidance was given on how exactly to do that, what to do, what things to look for, what things to think about when they were patrolling. So we asked them, how do you know that what you're seeing is bad? And the answer is generally, well, you know it when you see it. And we thought it would be a good idea to give them a little bit more than just, you know it when you see it. So Protect was the catalyst that brought key personnel together to get the TTP written so the frontline defenders could be effective with their actions. And the boat crews have now been given clear guidance on how to conduct their patrols through the revised TTP, which had been lacking for years. And as part of our Wagner Prize presentation, we were trying to show the proven impact of this program, and this in itself, getting better guidance, is proven impact. However, the Coast Guard has a strong desire to quantitatively measure its performance because we are in a public company that can measure in sales dollars or contract dollars. Our indicators for determining how we're doing is more difficult to develop. So for Protect, we have started to develop the idea of using Protect's Defender Utility calculation for our measure of effectiveness for the maritime patrols. By comparing the expected Defender Utility with the actual Defender Utility based on the actual patrol schedule and what they did, the Coast Guard will be able to compare the effectiveness of the executed patrols against what was scheduled. Simply put, that means the Protect provides an optimal schedule by which we can compare our suboptimal execution and measure that delta to determine how we're doing. Protect is definitely succeeding in what the Coast Guard needs it to do, which is to appear unpredictable. One Coast Guard member, I believe it was actually Dr. Dorenzo, was asked if we acquired a bunch of new small boats because, quote, the Coast Guard seemed to be everywhere all the time. So we did not, in fact, but now with this randomized patrol schedule, we seem that way. The Protect also received the Coast Guard Operational Excellence Award, which reflects the recognition of the impact and value of Protect. And our senior leadership of the Coast Guard recognizes the benefit of Protect and the partnership with academia. This partnership emerged from our need to solve complex problems and the university's need to find worthwhile research projects. So for some of our future work, and I think Craig is going to be talking about that as well, there's a few open research challenges that we hope to look into, including scaling up and handling different kinds of resources. And I will let Craig talk about how we are moving forward with that.
Be careful not to fall off here. Okay, hello. I'm here to eat, according to the menu. One of the interesting things about being the tail end Charlie on one of these panel discussions is that you start to rethink your whole process of what you want to say. So I've abandoned my entire speech and I've decided to talk to you about Nash equilibrium. So you see the horrified look on his face, and we're not going to do that. I'm just kidding. I'm going to talk about the, I was asked to actually address the problem or talk about how do you take a project that's theoretically based, turn it into an application that can be tested and verified and turned into an enterprise solution. And so I'm going to spend about 10 minutes trying to distill what's gone on in 2.5 years and give you some of the benefits of how I think it proceeded and the lessons learned. Some were observed, some were not. Let me go to the next slide if I can figure that out. There we go. I think one of the principal elements that we have provided from an RDC perspective is we put in an iterative RDT&E cycle, okay? And you probably saw that Dr. Gernstein had mentioned this in one of his slides. He said that you see a little bit of systems engineering here. He was referring to the RDT&E cycle. And I tried to think about what are the principal elements of the RDT&E cycle that were applied in this program. Well, first of all, you heard from Joe and from Lynn, we had to determine the needs, okay? And that was, the needs were first presented to us in a short 1-paragraph ideation, and we took that and we expanded that into a more defined and definitive set of requirements. Then you look at, then you need to develop the program and decide what your budget is. So in our situation here, we were starting with basically 2 abstract theories. You have utility theory and you have game theory or strategic decision-making theory. So, and modeling of that. How do you take that and turn it into something? So we divided it into 3 phases, and everybody's worked on these sort of programs before, where you build off, bite little pieces off and you work with it. You test it, you evaluate it, you get a win on it, you get acceptance, then you move on to the next piece, which is basically what we did. Now, the idea of developing solutions, one of the things that Melinda was working hard on was the fact that when he said it's a very vast difference to be guarding a port than it is to be guarding a airport or places where you have very constrained nodes, places where people go, choke points, those sort of things. And so this was a new problem for him. And what he didn't say was it expanded the possible outcomes, possible solutions, by factors of 10. It was e to the x. And so what we were trying to do here was to build a program that was going to exceed computational capabilities of known programs and algorithms. And so what they did was they worked on developing sophisticated new algorithms, and you've heard about some of these, and allowing us to keep it running on a laptop, believe it or not. Then the next thing is we introduced solutions, and what we wanted to do is give demonstrations, because through demonstration, what are you doing? You're testing it, but you're also communicating to the user group what you're going to do with this. They get to use it, they get to try it, they get to give you feedback, you can adjust and make commitments and path changes as you need to. If you don't do that, what you wind up with is a project that's not been at all communicated to the user group and resistance to want to use it, okay, because that's a change. And then we build capacity and we support enterprise administration and management and deployment. And so these are the things that went through my mind as we were building and developing this. Now I'd like to say that every single nook and cranny, twist and turn was foreseen by me, and it was already planned for, and I had all the magic pieces in place, and I'd be lying, because as you know, I was lucky, things happened. And you've heard about the constellation of people that have worked on this project. It's been a fantastic ride for 2.5 years, and everybody has contributed. And where's Mike Keene from headquarters? He's a big voice on our panels. And from the doctrinal standpoint, we had to make sure that this was something that the institution would be able to work with, that it fit into their operational domain. So we had Mike on all of our conversations. He attended all of our meetings. We had a variety of academics. We had Purdue with their vaccine helping us to visually analyze this, because you can imagine if I went to a bosun's mate and started talking to them about Nash equilibrium or about quantitative release. See, there we go. The point is that they wouldn't accept it. So to be honest, what I did was we worked hard to develop communication bridges that would translate these more difficult concepts into something that was operationally recognizable without losing the meaning of what we were doing. A couple of things did come out of this project that really were sort of groundbreaking for us. First of all, the question was, how do you even evaluate how you're doing your business now? And one of the outcomes of this was the development of the Adversarial Perspective Team, the APT. And this was a joint effort between MIFIC Land and Land Area and RDC and D11, or D1 and Sector Boston at this point. And we put together a small team of people who went out and observed the actual patrols being performed pre-protect. And these people were our experts in thinking like Al-Qaeda. This was our cell that we wanted them to replicate. And they performed their analysis, and they did it over about a 3-week period, sort of simulating what we would have in terms of a Al-Qaeda surveillance unit. A little bit shortened, but bottom line is the report came back and said we weren't very threatened at all. And they gave us reasons why. Okay, good. Let's go back and analyze that, and then we put out protect. They came back and they were, again, put onto the observing, and they came back and they said, well, we really felt like our bacon had been had a couple times. I'll give you one example. 2 o'clock in the morning, they're hiding behind bushes in a park in Boston, doing surveillance on one of their targets. Patrol boat comes up, and they see the light. They back a little more into the shadows, but then all of a sudden a big flight light comes on, and it sweeps across the beach and up into the hills, and it stops on them. Now, we asked the boat crew, did you see them? They said no. Okay, that's fine. But the observer, the bad guys, thought they'd been seen because it just hesitated just enough. Well, it just so happened 2 minutes later, a police car comes down into the park doing their patrol, but they think it was called by the boat crew who saw them with the floodlight. This is what you if you don't put an APT out there or something like that, it's hard to assess these non-tangibles. It's not just the math, it's the human behavior piece of this. And so these sort of activities were documented more and more from our APT team, both in New York and again in Boston. Secondly, if we're going to develop a system for doing patrols, and we're going to try to standardize that, you need a TTP, a Tactics, Techniques, Procedures, something that the crews that are across all the sectors and in all the ports can use and perform the schedules according to some set guidelines. And so we worked hard on the TTP development with FORSCOM and the whole team, constellation of people. And then eventually, at this point now, it got rolled into our doctrinal piece through the MISRO manual, the essential elements of it. And what this gives us is an ability to roll it out anywhere and refer people back to a Coast Guard authorized manual that's been signed out, and they can read and follow that guidance. And therefore, when we get our test data back, we're pretty sure that there's a standardized way in which this was perceived and the way it was executed. And therefore, you're not mixing apples and oranges. You're pretty sure you're getting the constellation of good data that you can assess. Okay, this is my only slide with pictures, by the way, so enjoy it. One of the things this was what motivated us. We talked about limited PWIC security resources. We only had selective checking. We had a system before where you were asked to visit certain points in the harbor so many times a month, and that was, if you did that, then you were considered good to go. Okay, and we wanted to change that because all the points that Melinda and Katie showed us that we were being predictable. Okay, training day, good days for baseball or football watching. And then, so that was a problem. We wanted to remove those gaps and measure them. Adversary strategic decision making is influenced by what is observed. Now remember, the important piece here is this is not a tactical tool, okay? This is not something you're going to go and use if you have a very dynamic changing environment. Gameplay is based on strategic decision making, so that's over long periods of time, right? And this is another piece that we had to communicate with the Coast Guard over and over again, because the users, typically being tactical people and thinkers, they begin to wonder, what if I don't go to this point today? Or what if I cancel the patrol for this day because of weather or some other higher priority mission? Then we were able to show them that it really didn't make a big difference, because over the big span of 30, 60, 90 days of performing patrols and having an observer watch this over a period of time, the same effect was given. In other words, minor changes in the schedule was not very sensitive. It wasn't causing a sensitivity in our results. Now, I talked about how we divided this into 3 phases, and phase 1 is completed. Phase 2 is will be completed this June, July. And phase 3 is the future piece, which includes the rollout. So I said we wanted to make things small and concise, so we started with small port, but a fully operational type port that would test all of our constructs, and that was in Boston, okay? And we only looked at a very simple single strategy game. We only looked at certain attack vectors, not the whole set of attack vectors. And then we modeled the PWIC's CIKR patrols only. We didn't use ferry escorts. I mean, these are the things that happen. They wanted us to immediately go to ferry escorts, include OGA, other government agencies in the system, and that would have overcomplicated something and it would have failed. So this RDT&E process, iterative process, kept us refocusing on those points we wanted just for that phase. And that was important because it got the team together and they didn't stray too badly. In phase 2, we expanded from Boston, which was very successful, into New York, and we've been adding other mission areas of the PWICS area. So we're experimenting now with ferry escort systems. How do you allocate your boats? Where do you put them? Can you change the routes? We're also beginning to experiment with mixed asset patrols, which are like helicopters, air and shore, air and surface, water, or all 3. And so this is expanding the locus of possible solutions within our patrol status. And through this effect, we think we can further confound an observer's thinking about how they would proceed. The point I want to make here is that if we don't perform a validation, a verification, then you can't say the model is doing what it's supposed to do. So at the end, what we're performing here starting in January is we're gathering the evidence package. Anybody who's done V&Vs, you know you have to pull together all the evidence. And then you submit this to an independent source who evaluates the model using your evidence package and then gives it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And basically saying that for the use cases that you define, that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So this is where we're at the end of phase 2, is to get that V&V done. In phase 3, this is the future work that Katie was referring to. This is a critical point. How many people have done research projects? Okay, and you know 9 times out of 10 it's difficult to move it from that nascent research effort into an enterprise solution because there are a lot of stumbling blocks along the way. Some of them are funding issues, some of them are ownership within the organization, who's going to control and manage it, and where's the best fit. So these are all the discussion points that are going on right now within the Coast Guard, and there's a couple of different avenues that we're working on with the senior decision makers, including PAC area and LANT area, and with the Commandant's group. And we're trying to find that perfect, that right fit. But in the meantime, so we don't lose the inertia we gained, because right now the field is calling for this. They're beginning to say, when's it going to be here? When are we going to install it here? So as interim solution is that the RDC, using its Modeling and Simulation Center of Excellence, has taken Protect on board. It's actually running within our systems at the RDC now, and we're beginning to produce schedules. Our first port rollout will be Captain Jenkson's and Sector Long Beach and LA, Long Beach. And that'll be turned out starting in December, in January. And then from there, we are offering up the ability to continue rolling this out to priority ports and waterways for the interim amount of time it takes for the Coast Guard to develop, find the program, find the right niche. In the meantime, we've also provided some possible strategies for enterprise deployment. And so we've looked at things like the IOC, that's the Integrated Operations Center in the port. It's a place where all the different DHSNEs can come together and work and plan, both in crisis and in normal, ordinary daily ops. And then we also are looking at the ability to find a final solution beyond this. So if we work with the units, we get the headquarters to accept it, then you give it a 2-year period. You needed that time. You know how the government funding problem goes. You know, it's 2 years, fiscal year ahead. The idea is that we can get this thing into a program, get it funded, and then turn that over to the enterprise solution, to a program office within the Coast Guard headquarters. So while we have these multiple strategies along the way to keep it going, in the meantime, we're looking at that final solution down the road, where it will be deployed nationally and maybe worldwide. Are there any questions for me, or I'm done talking, I guess. I need some water. Where's the food? So, thank you very much.
We've got about 4 minutes for questions, but I did want to do 2 summary points. The first is, how is Protect going to be used in the future? What's the future look like? You've talked about the Ports, Waterways, and Coastal Security mission, but we also see application in other areas, like our Living Marine Resource mission. We're committed to taking this process and using it to evaluate risk so that we get the absolute best usage of the resources that you, the taxpayers, provide. Both Melinda and Craig called out a lot of folks that have helped with this, but I'm going to be remiss if I didn't mention a couple others. The first is from day one, from Coast Guard 095, Frank Wood has been with us since day one. And Frank's one of the smartest risk guys in the Coast Guard, and his ability to whisper in both Melinda's and my ear about the way we should look at it from a strategic perspective has been imperative. The second's David Boyd, and I don't know where David is, but he's been our PAC area, there's David. He's been our PAC area teammate throughout this whole thing. And what's really interesting is when we first came to District 1 in Boston, he walked in and Admiral Neptune, yes, we have an admiral by the name of Neptune in the Coast Guard, When he walked in, he looked at David and said, "What are you doing here?" Because Admiral Neptune used to be the chief of staff out here. And David said, "Sir, this is not just a land area problem, this is a Coast Guard problem." And from that second on, Admiral Neptune became one of our biggest cheerleaders as an enterprise-wide function. We've still got a long way to go. Craig touched on it. You probably noticed we didn't mention the word aviator in this, and we're fortunate to have the CO of Los Angeles Long Beach here, Commander Tim Shang, but we had him and the CO of our air station in Atlantic City, Captain Nick Bartolotto, on the phone for what we told them was going to be an hour, and I think, Tim, we took you through lunch for about 4 or 5 hours talking about how we integrate the helicopter portion of our ports, waterways, and coastal security mission. Interesting thing, and Melinda's just happy as heck because it's another dissertation. The other one is, as you know, we have infrastructure inside the port, and the Coast Guard sends inspectors to validate the security of those Maritime Transportation Security Act infrastructure. Well, we're going to include that as part of Protect too. How our shoreside inspectors help to contribute to addressing risk. So by the time this is over, we'll have the water side, the shore side, and the aviation side, and the ability, as Craig mentioned, to replicate it throughout our major ports in the country. That's where we're going to be when this is all over. The thing I want to leave you with before questions is this. Whenever you take a look at the word risk, you have to take a look at it in the context of the maritime transportation system. And that's the way that we've approached this. The DHS Risk Lexicon has been a wonderful thing because it provides us a departmental-wide definition. But the ability to show value, the ability to show effectiveness, the ability to show optimization is what we're going to achieve with this model. And trust me, from where we started 2.5 years ago with the Guards and Hogan's Heroes, I think we've come a long way. And a nice way to kind of end it before the questions and answers. So I've got my expert team up here. Who would like to ask the first question? Because again, 3 questions before we leave. Who's got number 1? Please.
Let's talk about the randomization of the patrols. Has that affected the other Coast Guard missions? Is there any look at that?
Well, I'll tell you initially, when you say missions, not necessarily so, but the feedback that we got from Boston and New York was that the time that they've had to spend on maintenance and training went up, because what was kind of a haphazard scheduling thing, I mean, they did it, but now that they knew that they were going to be underway from X to X, they would plan the maintenance and the training around that, and they got more people qualified, and they got better maintenance on the RBSs and RBMs. So that was one part of it that was really a great benefit. But we see application of game theory to our Living Marine Resource mission. We see it to our counter-drug mission. We're taking a look at how we roll out Protect on our western rivers, which is going to be a really interesting situation because you have vast amounts of land. And everybody thinks Coast Guard coast. Well, the middle of America, we've got a massive stake when you got stuff like chlorine, toluene, xylene moving on barges. So that's another area where we're going to use the limited resources to the best advantage that we can. And our R&D Center of Modeling and Simulation Expertise is going to be able to help us do that and build the game boards based on Melinda's team's work. Yes, sir, Admiral Z.
Yeah, how would this normalize activity during a heightened MARSEC level?
Actually, we've been able to do pulse ops using Protect, in which, remember, Protect is designed to take whatever you have going in and optimize it. So for example, D1 wanted to run a boating while intoxicated pulse op. They increased the number of vessels, they increased the number of hours. We gave the information to Melind. His team provided the best optimization of that. We actually took a look at using the same kind of approach for Admiral Parks on July 4th weekend up in the Great Lakes. Where's the best place to position and when? And that's the way we were able to optimize it. And the benefit from Boston was that they felt that they positioned their vessels at the best times to be able to affect that. And we think we're going to be able to scale up and scale down. In fact, we were talking about it during the break. How do you do it during MARSEC 2? Can you use it during MARSEC 2? The other big application we haven't talked about is the LNG transits coming in and out of Boston. By using Protect, we felt that we had a better protection of the port. Even though you have this massive armada surrounding the LNG, we were able to get a better optimization of our assets because they were doing things like covering the back door that we hadn't done previously. Does that answer your question, sir? Yeah. Admiral Sullivan, 2 admirals back to back. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Just a follow-on question is, it might be in the too hard locker right now, but bringing this into the Port of LA, LA is a good example of the need and requirement for port partners. You have very effective Marine police here, a lot of other port partners that Jim and his staff works with day to day. How quick could you assimilate some of those other port partners into the model?
We took a hard look at, as Craig mentioned, to OGA, to other government agencies, and I'll speak briefly about LALB. When we were doing the Underwater Terrorism Preventiveness Plan, we took a look at, and this was the plan the Coast Guard developed, to take a look at the underwater environment in the port and then develop plans to support it. We did 50 of those around the country. The place where we saw the absolute best cooperation of any port in the country was LALB. So our belief was, and we've had some discussions on how we start to get the other agencies that Captain Jenkins and his staff works with on a daily basis into that, because the cooperation is so incredible out here. A little bit harder problem in New York, Admiral, as you know from when you were the District 1 commander. They don't like each other too much out there. Go ahead, Melinda. Or Craig, either one.
So certainly from our own perspective, including OGA into our model is an interesting challenge. That means it's a good thing, and we are willing to, we are ready to, we have some ideas on how to do it, and it's scheduled, I guess, in New York, for example, in the spring, that we should be able to incorporate some of whatever data is given to us in terms of OGA.
And if we believe if we can get it to work in New York, we'll be able to get it to work everywhere, simply because the NYPD's got such a massive presence there, as does the other entities on the New Jersey side. They've even got a naval militia in New York that we would deal with. The other neat thing that we were looking at, and I'll just digress for 10 seconds, is how the Coast Guard Auxiliary plays into this. America's Waterway Watch, which you're going to hear a little bit about later in the briefing, is an incredible force multiplier with these wonderful volunteers that we have. They're eyes and ears on the water. And we've had some lengthy discussions on how you mathematically capture what they provide on the water. And again, big force multiplier, especially on the western rivers. I saw another question. Admiral Jones, and then we have, I think, 2 questions back there.
Joe, yeah, this is great, and obviously we're getting a lot of traction out in the field, the different districts, but as a headquarters guy, I'm looking at it from a headquarters perspective, and then how do we get traction in the headquarters? How do we get a program, maybe within DCO, to take responsibility for this? To me, that means where are there savings that we can bring into the building, boat hours. So in your measurements, have you gotten to the point where you can measure and track savings of boat hours so that you can justify this in my world at headquarters in order to garner support?
Melinda initially talked, you want to talk about the utility curves?
So I guess from our perspective, the kind of the trend expected utility curves that I showed, I might have gone through them rather quickly, but we can say, given what was going on before, the kinds of patrols that were going on before, versus now with a more optimized patrols, that we can do with fewer hours what was going on before, given the models that we have.
Okay, and I get that, but I still want to translate this into headquarters talk, and I think there's a need. You say fewer hours, but just as long as you've been able to, or will be able to, in phase 3, document and sort of validate or evaluate those hours so that we can have the conversation at headquarters where this needs to be pretty soon and see that we can spread this throughout the rest of the Coast Guard.
2 things. Coast Guard 741 right now is evaluating Protect based on a request from our dear friends at the R&D Center, got up through Coast Guard 9. And I think if you look at Melinda's utility curves, that break shows you the sweet spot. Now, if Admiral Parker and Admiral Zumkoff, as the operational commanders, say we've got to take a 20% cut in X, we can then go back and show you the delta, risk-wise, that we would save and lose, what we would lose in capability, but also what the savings would translate to. The other benefit that we believe has not been captured, we haven't figured out how to do this yet, is we think that our maintenance processes, and we've talked a lot to the DAL about this, the maintenance processes has gotten along to be better, and by having better chances to plan your maintenance, you're going to save in the long run when the systems break. So this is, I mean, Melinda talks about exciting times. The next year in this and being able to prove to senior leadership how valuable Protect is not only in hours saved, its optimization, its effectiveness, and the ability to take OGA and meld it into a one DHS concept, which would make my dear friend Matt Clark's day if we were able to get other agencies into this. There was one more question, and then Isaac's going to give me the hook.
Let me finish answering
Oh,
that question.
even better.
Because since those utility curves have not been generated for every port, there is the possibility that you're way out on the right, where you have many hours that are being used, where they're not gaining you a significant reduction in the risk. So you may be able to bring that back to a certain point before you hit the knee on the downward slope and save all those hours. So there's, as you do the utility curves with all these points, you'll be able to evaluate that on a port-by-port basis.
I think we, yes ma'am.
My voice may come out of me, so I had to put this out, but it's really for Admiral Parker. I'm part of the Seahawk, what it used to be. I talked too loud, I didn't say I needed it. I'm part of the, I used to be part of the Seahawk Task Force, now it's the Seahawk Charleston Interagency Operations Center. But what you're talking about is really what we do every single day. You know, we take one Coast Guard guy here, a Customs guy, we get on a Charleston County boat, and we get a job done. The Coast Guard boat didn't even have to leave the dock, and we work together every single day. I mean, what I propose is, as these interagency operations centers are really being put out around the country, I mean, that's the way to do it as a model. We do it at Seahawk using Protect, because it's already put in place, working together.
When we did our initial literature reviews, Captain Beeson's work down at Seahawk was one of the first places that we started with. And I've talked to Scott many, many, many times about how Seahawk was integrated, and that's what we gave to Malin. When Malin first took this on, we handed him a literature review that was about 4 feet high of stuff that had been done previously. I do want to ask one question myself. How many students do we have in the room? Okay, all of you should take away something. You know, a lot of times the DHS Centers of Excellence and just academia in general does a lot of things to make sure that PhDs, dissertations are completed and master's theses are completed. This is a real world application of the kind of work that's cutting edge, that's going to make a massive impact in how we do our operations. And I hope you take that away, because getting those degrees are incredibly difficult. It's incredibly challenging. And to be able to take away something where you see an impact on national security and homeland security, that's a big deal. It really, truly is. And when you've got great folks from academia, like our teammates from USC and Purdue, and all the other centers of excellence that we work with, it really does make a difference. I think there's one other question, and then I think we're done. Yes, sir.
I'm interested to know when you might be doing the ports of San Diego or Jacksonville or Norfolk, and perhaps the impact that DoD might have on your lobby.
Funny you should answer that question, or ask that question. Last Wednesday, Rich Noland is the director of ATFP for the Naval Installations Command. And Rich and I talked for over an hour on how we would do it in Norfolk and in Jacksonville. We've already got the Coast Guard Maritime Force Protection Unit working up in Kings Bay, and we've got a pretty good idea of how that security is established. But we've got, what, Katie, 16 ports, at least on the first round, and then another bunch in the Western Rivers that we're looking at. Yeah. So I mean, we've already got based on what each port is component with, to be able to go forward with that and build a game board, and the R&D Center is going to help us do that. But that's the intention. It is absolutely the intention.
I'd be interested in following the progress.
Maybe you can talk to Coast Guard headquarters and we can move it along as a program of record and get some support from DoD. Any other questions? If not, our panel really appreciates your time, and I guess, Isaac, we have a break for 30 minutes. Enjoy.